Mr. Fukuyama, you are now on the entry ban list in Russia. People on Twitter in Russia made jokes like, that's the end of history. How, obviously hinting on your concept of end of history. How do you feel about this joke and more broadly about being in this list now?
Well, first of all, being on the list, I regard as an honor. I think that all of the important foreign critics of Russia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine have been put on the list, and I was actually wondering why it took them so long to get to me. But now that I'm on, that's fine. You know, it affects people who are scholars of Russia, other academics who study Russia and actually need to go there. I was going to go there uh, a little more than a year ago, actually, to be on a panel with Alexei Navalny. But obviously, that didn't happen first because of COVID, and then because of the deepening of the tyranny of Putin's government. So I don't anticipate any need to go to Russia anytime in the foreseeable future. So it's fine with me. As to the jokes about the end of history, I get, two or three of these every single day, and I have for the last 30 years. So I find them rather old at this point.
Um, some more than 130 days into the conflict, Putin recently said, "Oh, we haven't even properly began in the Ukraine, meaning the war." Have you heard this quote? And what do you think? Is he bluffing for his internal audience? Does he something in reserve? What do you think of that one?
Well, I think he's lying as he is about many things. I think that the Western military analysts that have looked at the Russian force posture have noted that right now Russia is experiencing a very severe manpower shortage. They've also lost, perhaps a third of all of the forces that they originally massed to uh, defeat Ukraine. The estimates of Russian casualties are uncertain, but it's possibly 20,000 dead and maybe 60,000 wounded on top of that, prisoners and so forth. And for a country the size of Russia, that's not a small operation. That's really pretty much a military disaster. So I think that actually, given that the Russians have only made very marginal gains in the 2 months since they started focusing on Donbass, I don't think they've got a lot in reserve. And I think that Putin is bluffing when he says that they haven't even started.
Still, even if it's a disaster, Russia could inflict much pain to its neighbor Ukraine. Um, I would like to ask you something about the strategy of Ukraine in the situation. We see that Russia's goal is obviously to ruin as much as it can, and but whatever's Kremlin's final level of damage might be, the Ukraine seems to survive this attack. It doesn't look that it well. It looks like it will survive. So, what kind of strategy could be given from the Kiev's perspective to the war and the post-war time? What do you think the strategy, the successful strategy, might be?
Well, I think the most realistic strategy at this point is to focus on the south, to reopen uh, Ukraine's access to the Black Sea by retaking Kherson and other ports on the Sea of Azov. That's more important than the Donbass. I think retaking the Donbass is going to be quite difficult to accomplish, in the next few months. But by the end of the summer, you could see some real progress in the south. It's really, really important for Ukraine to recover access so that it can resume exports of all of its agricultural commodities out of its Black Sea ports and to break the Russian blockade of Odessa. So I think that, I imagine that that's actually what they're going to focus on. They've started an offensive around Kherson. They've made some progress there. And I would think that if, let's say, by September or October, they've actually liberated that area, that would be the opportunity to actually start a serious negotiation about a ceasefire. But I don't think they can do that before they've opened up their access to the outside world.
One of Russian calculus was that many in Russian leadership believe the West is in a decline, and the West wouldn't be united to help Ukraine survive. And the unity of the West, as we see it, could it change with Trump being re-elected? I saw you also made some Twitter remarks on how the West should be, in fact, let me find the word, alerted on this possibility. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Well, I think that there's two big dangers. The first one is in terms of European support for Ukraine over the winter. The Russians have already cut off supplies of natural gas, and I think that Europe is going to have a real problem substituting for Russian gas as the weather gets colder. And so that's one issue. And then the second issue is the one you mentioned, that Republican support for Ukraine has been slowly deteriorating. Trump is on the other side. He's pro-Russian. He's not pro-Ukrainian. And obviously, if he makes a comeback in 2024, that solves all of Russia's problems for it, because he's apparently committed to pulling out the US out of NATO. And so they will have achieved their major objectives simply by this change in American politics. And that's why I think it's really important that Ukraine make some progress and regain the military momentum over the summer, because unity in the West really depends on people believing that there is a military solution in the near term to the problem. If they think that we're simply facing an extended stalemate that's going to go on forever, then I think the unity will start breaking, and there'll be more calls for Ukraine to give up territory in order to stop the war.
Mr. Fukuyama, another question on Russia. You have been looking at the regime there, and what do you think? Is this kind of regime we have now is something that is going to stay? Should the world adapt to a new kind of political structure in Russia? Is it something, a big international spoiler to everybody has to adapt to? How do you see Russia in a broader global perspective? What kind of political regime is it?
Well, it actually, more than anything else, resembles Nazi Germany at this point. I mean, its only ideology is a kind of extreme nationalism, but it's even less developed than that of the Nazis, and it's also a very poorly institutionalized regime. It really revolves around one man, Vladimir Putin, who really controls all of the big levers of power. So if you compare it to China, they're very, very different. China has a big communist party that has 90 million members. It has a lot of internal discipline. There's a lot of rules regarding who gets promoted and how the system is run. In Russia's case, you don't have that kind of institutionalization. It really does revolve around Putin and his particular choices. And so once he goes, it's not clear what's going to happen. I imagine there'd be a big power struggle among all the power ministries and the internal forces that are the basis of his power. So I don't think it's a stable regime. I don't think it has a clear ideology that it can project outwards. I think that the people that align with it are simply people that don't like the West for different reasons. They can be on the left, as in the case of, let's say Venezuela, or they can be on the right, as in the case of Hungary. But there's really no consistent ideology underpinning the current Russian regime.
Russia has many conflicts with its neighbors, and one of them is Kazakhstan. You've been following the Tokayev policies recently. I've seen it on Twitter. Do you think Tokayev's rule is stable enough to oppose Russian leadership in something that resembles a trade or beginning trade war between Russia and Kazakhstan?
Well, look, I can't answer that question. I just don't know enough about the internal politics of Kazakhstan. But I do think that it's very interesting that Tokayev has taken the measures that he did. The recent Central Asian summit, was actually quite humiliating because, there was no one to actually greet Putin when he got off his airplane. And it's not just Kazakhstan. I think many of the countries in that region are really unhappy to be satellites of Russia, and they're seeking to be able to build some space. Whether they can succeed in that, I hope they can, but I just don't know enough to give you an answer.
Now, probably my last question is, and it's more serious one now on your concept of the end of history. Now, do you have an update on it after 30 years? Looking at the global situation now with this war in Ukraine, started by Russia, looking at rise of China, looking at many crises of the Western community, how do you see your concept now?
Well, look, we're in a different situation than we were 30 years ago, where there's been setbacks to democracy across the board, including in the United States and India and other, big democratic countries over the last few years. But the progress of history has never been linear. We had huge setbacks in the 1930s that we survived. We had another set of setbacks in the 1970s with the oil crisis and inflation in many parts of the world. So I don't think that the idea of historical progress is a dead idea. I think that nobody should expect that it's always going to be upwards and onwards, that sometimes you do have setbacks, but the underlying institutions and ideas are strong, and they've survived over a very long period of time, and I expect them to continue to survive today.
What do you think is the war in Ukraine and let's say other burning political crises are basically shadowing and neglecting people's focus on the more global and more dangerous climate crisis?
Well, I don't think it's a choice, between one or the other. Obviously, the short-term energy needs have led to a revival of fossil fuels and slowed down the progress towards reducing carbon emissions. But it is a temporary, setback, and I think both of these issues have to be dealt with. It's not a choice of one or the other. You're really going to have to take both of them seriously. But the climate crisis is a slowly unfolding one that, will continue to be with us for the next, couple of generations. And so I don't think the fact that we're going backwards right now is necessarily the final position we'll end up in.
Mr. Fukuyama, thank you very much for this interview.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much.
I'm stopping. All right. Okay.